The halls of the United States Congress often serve as the ultimate stage for the unfolding of constitutional dramas where the stakes involve the very bedrock of American democracy. In a recent and particularly charged hearing, the atmosphere crackled with a palpable tension that transcended routine legislative oversight, signaling a profound institutional rift. Representative Shri Thanadar stood at the forefront of this confrontation, leveling grave accusations against Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem that resonated far beyond the committee room. These allegations, centered on perjury and direct violations of constitutional mandates, represent a significant escalation in the ongoing debate over executive overreach. The discourse that followed was not merely a political skirmish but a fundamental inquiry into the integrity of those entrusted with the nation's security and legal adherence. At the heart of Congressman Thanadar's argument was a meticulously compiled dossier of evidence suggesting a systemic disregard for federal judicial authority within the department. The allegations focused on specific instances where deportation flights were allegedly conducted in open defiance of standing federal court injunctions, a move that threatens the principle of judicial review. Furthermore, the claim that American citizens had been unlawfully detained struck a chord with constitutional scholars and civil liberties advocates alike across the political spectrum. Such actions, if proven true, would signify a startling departure from the due process protections guaranteed by the Fifth and 14th Amendments. The representative's presentation was characterized by a demand for absolute transparency, framing the issue as a choice between the rule of law and bureaucratic impunity. Secretary Noem's defense strategy was as assertive as the accusations leveled against her, reflecting a broader ideological friction between the executive branch and certain segments of the judiciary. Rather than addressing the specific procedural failures cited by the committee, she pivoted toward a critique of the judicial philosophy guiding the lower courts. By labeling certain members of the bench as activist judges, Noem attempted to frame the legal setbacks of her department as the result of political interference rather than statutory noncompliance. This rhetorical maneuver is a common feature in modern American political discourse, yet it took on a sharper edge in the context of a formal congressional inquiry. She frequently invoked the department's success rate before the Supreme Court as a primary metric of its legal and moral legitimacy. The confrontation reached a fever pitch when the discussion shifted from broad legal theories to the granular details of documented immigration enforcement errors. When pressed for direct answers regarding specific cases of administrative failure, the Secretary opted for a posture of strategic ambiguity that frustrated her interrogators. This refusal to provide succinct explanations for operational discrepancies led to a breakdown in the traditional give-and-take of the oversight process. Perhaps the most striking moment of the session occurred when Noem reinterpreted calls for her resignation as a perverse validation of her effectiveness. This framing suggests a political landscape where controversy is not seen as a sign of failure but as a byproduct of disruptive and successful policy implementation. This unfolding crisis of accountability raises haunting questions about the veracity of testimony provided by high-ranking officials to the American public and its representatives. When the mechanisms designed to ensure check and balances are met with obfuscation, the entire structure of representative government begins to feel the strain. The hearing illuminated a growing trend where the definition of truth is often contingent upon one's position within the prevailing political architecture. It is no longer just a question of whether laws were broken, but whether the institutions designed to enforce those laws still respect the authority of the courts. This ideological standoff serves as a microcosm of a larger national struggle over the limits of executive power in an increasingly polarized era. The implications of these proceedings extend into the realm of international perception and the domestic trust in federal law enforcement agencies. If the Department of Homeland Security is perceived as operating outside the bounds of judicial oversight, it risks undermining the very security it is tasked with protecting. Trust is the invisible currency of governance, and once it is devalued through allegations of perjury and constitutional negligence, it is difficult to restore. The public is left to navigate a sea of conflicting narratives, where the line between a necessary enforcement action and a civil rights violation becomes blurred. Consequently, the role of Congress as a watchdog becomes more vital than ever, even as its ability to compel honest answers is tested. The legal framework of the United States is designed to prevent any single individual or department from becoming a law unto themselves. However, the testimony provided during this hearing suggests that the practical application of this principle is under significant duress. The use of deportation flights as a tool of policy, when conducted against the backdrop of judicial stay orders, challenges the hierarchy of legal authority. It posits a scenario where operational necessity is weighed more heavily than the dictates of a federal judge. This shift in the balance of power, if left unaddressed, could set a precedent that future administrations might exploit to bypass legislative or judicial hurdles. In analyzing the Secretary's performance, one must consider the pressure of managing one of the largest and most complex bureaucracies in the federal government. The Department of Homeland Security is often at the center of the nation's most volatile political storms, from border security to domestic counterterrorism. However, the complexity of the mission does not grant an exemption from the constitutional requirement to be truthful under oath. Perjury is not merely a legal technicality. It is an affront to the integrity of the legislative process and the public's right to know. The tension in the room was a reflection of the high stakes involved when the veracity of a cabinet member is publicly called into doubt. As the session progressed, it became clear that the objective of the inquiry was not just to gather facts but to expose a perceived culture of arrogance within the department. Representative Thanadar's persistent questioning sought to strip away the polished veneer of bureaucratic language to reveal the human cost of administrative errors. The detention of citizens, even if accidental, represents a failure of the highest order in a system that prides itself on protecting individual liberty. Each minute of the hearing served to deepen the divide between those who see the department as a vital shield and those who see it as an unchecked sword. This polarization ensures that the fallout from this hearing will resonate through the upcoming legislative cycles and potentially the judicial system. Ultimately, the transcript of this hearing serves as a historical marker for a moment of extreme friction between the branches of government. It captures a moment where the executive branch, represented by Noem, felt emboldened to challenge the very legitimacy of the judicial branch's oversight. This is not merely a debate over immigration policy, but a debate over the nature of the American Republic itself. Whether the system of checks and balances will hold firm or continue to erode depends on the actions taken in the aftermath of such explosive revelations. The pursuit of accountability remains a grueling and often partisan endeavor, yet it is the only path toward ensuring that the government remains of, by, and for the people. The legal controversy surrounding the deportation flights initiated under Secretary Noem's watch serves as a critical case study in the limits of administrative discretion. Within the American legal framework, a federal court injunction is not a mere suggestion but a binding mandate that requires immediate and absolute compliance from government agencies. When Representative Thanadar introduced evidence suggesting that these flights continued despite explicit judicial halts, he touched upon a nerve that connects to the very heart of the separation of powers. The executive branch possesses the logistical power to enforce immigration laws, yet that power is strictly curtailed by the oversight of the third branch of government. If a department can unilaterally decide which court orders to follow and which to ignore based on operational convenience, the hierarchy of the law is effectively dismantled. This defiance creates a precarious situation where the judiciary's ability to protect individual rights is rendered moot by the sheer velocity of executive action. In the context of deportation, the finality of the act, sending an individual across international borders, makes the timing of legal intervention a matter of life and death or permanent separation from family. The allegations brought forth in the hearing imply that the Department of Homeland Security utilized the speed of its aviation assets to outpace the slow grind of the judicial process. Such a strategy, if substantiated, represents a tactical subversion of the law that undermines the spirit of the American adversarial system. It suggests an environment where the ends justify the means, a philosophy that is historically antithetical to the principles of American jurisprudence. Secretary Noem's response to these specific charges was characterized by a reliance on the broader mission of national sovereignty and border integrity. By shifting the focus away from procedural compliance, she sought to reposition the department as the sole defender of the nation's interests against what she perceived as judicial interference. This perspective views the law not as a rigid boundary but as a flexible framework that must bend to the urgent needs of national security. However, this interpretation often clashes with the reality that the Constitution was designed specifically to provide boundaries that do not bend, even in times of perceived crisis. The debate over these flights is therefore a debate over whether security can be used as a blanket exemption from the requirement to follow the specific rulings of a district or appellate court. The discussion then turned to the deeply troubling reports of the unlawful detention of American citizens, a scenario that represents a catastrophic failure of the department's vetting protocols. In a nation where the Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures, the deprivation of liberty for a citizen without due process is an inexcusable breach of the social contract. The hearing underscored that these were not isolated incidents but were presented as symptoms of a broader systemic indifference to constitutional safeguards. When the machinery of the state is geared toward mass enforcement, the individual rights of citizens can sometimes be crushed under the weight of bureaucratic momentum. This particular line of questioning highlighted the vulnerability of every person within the borders if the primary enforcement agency is not held to the highest standards of accuracy. Secretary Noem's defense against these allegations was notable for its lack of a detailed accounting for how such errors occurred or how they would be prevented in the future. Instead of a technical explanation or an admission of procedural flaws, the discourse remained at a high level of political abstraction. This refusal to engage with the mechanics of the failure suggests a defensive posture that prioritizes political survival over administrative reform. In the American political system, the credibility of a department head is often measured by their willingness to take responsibility for the errors of their subordinates. By framing the calls for her resignation as a badge of honor, Noem effectively signaled that she does not view these administrative failures as personal or professional liabilities, but as the unavoidable friction of a successful policy. The interaction between the representative and the secretary also illuminated the growing divide in how the role of the judiciary is perceived in modern governance. Noem's use of the term activist judges is a powerful linguistic tool designed to delegitimize the rulings of the court in the eyes of the public. It portrays the judge not as an impartial arbiter of the law, but as a political actor with a hidden agenda. This rhetoric is particularly potent in a polarized environment where the judiciary is increasingly seen as another battlefield for partisan warfare. However, when a cabinet official uses such language in a formal hearing, it carries the weight of the executive branch's disapproval, potentially chilling the independence of the lower courts. Furthermore, the emphasis on the department's success at the Supreme Court level acts as a form of legal survivorship bias. It implies that as long as the highest court in the land eventually validates a general policy, the interim violations of law or specific court orders are irrelevant. This logic ignores the reality that most legal disputes are resolved in lower courts, and that these courts hold the authority to govern the behavior of the executive branch on a day-to-day basis. Relying solely on the Supreme Court as a shield suggests a disregard for the entire vertical structure of the federal judiciary. It creates a vacuum of accountability for the thousands of actions taken by the department that will never reach the High Court's docket. As the hearing progressed, the tension between the legislative branch's oversight duty and the executive branch's operational autonomy became a central theme. The power of the purse and the power of investigation are the primary tools Congress uses to restrain a wayward administration. Yet, as demonstrated by the Secretary's performance, these tools are only as effective as the transparency of the witnesses involved. When a witness provides answers that are perceived as evasive or contradictory to documented evidence, the legislative process is stalled. This stagnation leads to a public perception of government dysfunction, where the truth is obscured by a fog of political maneuvering and carefully rehearsed talking points. The allegations of perjury are perhaps the most damaging to the long-term health of the institution. If the public and their representatives cannot rely on the testimony of a cabinet member, the foundation of democratic oversight is compromised. Truth-telling in a congressional hearing is not a courtesy. It is a legal requirement that ensures the government remains accountable to the people who fund it. The persistence of Congressman Thanadar in presenting conflicting evidence was an attempt to force a moment of clarity in a sea of ambiguity. His efforts reflected a commitment to the idea that no official, regardless of their rank or the importance of their mission, is above the obligation to be honest with the American people. This second phase of the analysis reveals a department at a crossroads, where the pursuit of policy objectives has come into direct conflict with the requirements of the legal system. The drama within the committee room was a manifestation of a deeper struggle for the soul of American administration, one that pits efficiency against legality and political loyalty against constitutional duty. The refusal to provide direct answers regarding documented enforcement errors only served to deepen the suspicion that the department is operating with a level of autonomy that is inconsistent with Republican values. As the sun set on the hearing, the questions raised remained largely unanswered, leaving the public to wonder if the crisis of accountability had only just begun. The ethical dimensions of the testimony provided by Secretary Noem extend far beyond the immediate legal implications of her statements, touching upon the moral character required for high-level public service. In the American political tradition, a cabinet secretary is not merely a political appointee but a steward of the public trust, tasked with executing the laws of the land with both vigor and integrity. When the discourse in a congressional hearing shifts toward allegations of perjury, it signals a breakdown in the ethical baseline that allows the federal government to function effectively. The accusations leveled by Representative Thanadar suggest a scenario where the internal culture of the Department of Homeland Security may prioritize ideological outcomes over factual accuracy. This creates an environment where the truth becomes a secondary consideration to the maintenance of a specific political narrative, a dangerous precedent for any democratic institution. The psychological impact on the public when witnessing such a blatant dismissal of documented evidence cannot be overstated. When a high-ranking official characterizes legitimate judicial oversight as the work of activist judges, it provides a blueprint for the public to disregard the authority of the courts themselves. This rhetoric contributes to a climate of institutional cynicism, where the average citizen begins to view every branch of government as a partisan actor rather than a neutral enforcer of the law. The erosion of this trust is a slow process, yet it is accelerated by hearings where the objective of the witness seems to be the obfuscation of the truth rather than its revelation. This strategy of deflection may offer short-term political protection for the Secretary, but it inflicts long-term damage on the credibility of the department she leads. Furthermore, the dismissal of calls for resignation as a form of professional flattery reveals a startling detachment from the traditional norms of political accountability. In decades past, a documented failure of the magnitude described, such as the unlawful detention of citizens or the violation of federal court orders, would have prompted a somber acknowledgement of error. Instead, the The current political climate allows for the transformation of failure into a signal of strength among a partisan base. This inversion of accountability metrics means that the more an official is criticized by the opposing party or the judiciary, the more they are celebrated by their supporters as a fearless disruptor of the status quo. This dynamic effectively insulates officials from the consequences of their actions, rendering the standard tools of legislative oversight less effective. The specific instances of immigration enforcement errors discussed during the hearing serve as a window into the human consequences of administrative hubris. Behind every deportation flight conducted in violation of a court order is an individual or a family whose legal rights were bypassed by the machinery of the state. When the Secretary refuses to engage with these details, she effectively dehumanizes the subjects of her department's policies, treating them as statistics rather than people with constitutional protections. The American legal system is built on the idea that the process is just as important as the outcome, yet the testimony suggests a departmental focus on outcomes at the expense of procedural justice. This shift in focus is a hallmark of an administration that views legal constraints as obstacles to be navigated rather than boundaries to be respected. The role of Representative Thanadar in this exchange was to act as the conscience of the legislative branch, reminding the executive of its subordinate role to the law. His use of documented evidence was not just a tactic for the cameras, but a necessary exercise in reasserting the primacy of facts in a post-truth political era. By forcing the Secretary to confront the discrepancy between her testimony and the reality of her department's actions, he highlighted the inherent fragility of a system that relies on the honesty of its participants. The resulting impasse demonstrates that when an official is willing to endure the discomfort of a public grilling without yielding to the truth, the power of Congress to enact change is severely limited. This realization is sobering for those who believe in the efficacy of the checks and balances system. The controversy also brings to light the increasing militarization of civilian law enforcement and the lack of transparency that often accompanies it. The Department of Homeland Security operates with a level of logistical capability that rivals some of the world's most powerful militaries, yet it is supposed to be bound by the same constitutional limits as any local police force. The allegations regarding the use of aviation assets to bypass judicial stays suggest a level of operational autonomy that is difficult for Congress to monitor in real time. This information gap creates a sanctuary for executive overreach, where actions can be taken and completed before the judicial or legislative branches can intervene. The hearing was a rare moment where the curtain was pulled back on this internal dynamic, revealing a department that may be moving faster than the law can keep up with. In the broader context of American history, this hearing will likely be viewed as a pivotal moment in the ongoing struggle between executive power and judicial independence. The Secretary's frequent references to the Supreme Court as her only valid supervisor ignore the foundational principle that the law is interpreted at all levels of the federal bench. By delegitimizing the lower courts, the executive branch attempts to consolidate power and limit the venues where its actions can be challenged. This strategy, if successful, would fundamentally alter the landscape of American law, making the protection of civil liberties dependent on the narrow window of cases that the Supreme Court chooses to hear. It is a gamble that risks the stability of the entire legal hierarchy for the sake of immediate policy implementation. The ethical vacuum created by these proceedings also invites a discussion on the role of the bureaucracy itself in resisting or facilitating unlawful orders. If the leadership of a department is perceived as being willing to ignore court orders, that attitude inevitably trickles down to the rank-and-file officers. The hearing raised the question of whether there is a culture of compliance within the DHS or a culture of evasion. When officers see their leaders dismissing judicial rulings with impunity, the incentive to strictly adhere to the law is diminished. This cultural shift within an agency can lead to a systemic disregard for the rights of the public, creating a feedback loop of litigation and administrative failure. As we analyze the fallout from this confrontation, it is clear that the crisis of accountability is not just about one secretary or one department. It is a systemic issue that reflects the deepening fissures in the American social contract. The ability to disagree on policy while agreeing on the facts and the law is the glue that holds a diverse republic together. When that glue fails, as it appeared to during this hearing, the resulting friction can lead to institutional collapse. The Secretary's defiance and the Representative's persistence are two sides of a coin representing a nation that is struggling to define the limits of its own power. The pursuit of the truth in this context is not just a legislative task but a national necessity. The final segments of this phase of the inquiry left many observers wondering if the mechanisms of government are still capable of producing a consensus on reality. If a cabinet official can be presented with evidence of a violation and simply label the source as activist, the very concept of objective truth is under assault. This is the kickdom of a political era where narrative is king and evidence is merely an inconvenience to be managed. The implications for the future of American democracy are profound, as the system relies on a shared commitment to the rules of the game. Without that commitment, the halls of Congress become not a place for deliberation, but a theater for the exercise of raw power and the dismissal of the public's right to an honest government. The historical context of executive friction with the legislative and judicial branches provides a necessary lens through which to view the current standoff between Secretary Noem and the Congressional Committee. Throughout American history, the expansion of the administrative state has frequently led to periods of intense constitutional stress, where the boundaries of departmental authority are tested. However, the current era is marked by a unique willingness to publicly challenge the foundational legitimacy of the courts as a defense mechanism against oversight. By examining past instances of executive overreach, one can see a pattern where the restoration of balance usually requires a firm reassertion of legislative power. The allegations of perjury in this context are not just about a single testimony but represent a challenge to the historical norm that the executive branch remains answerable to the people's representatives. The technicalities of immigration law and the logistics of deportation flights serve as the practical battlefield for this ideological war. In the American legal system, the concept of a stay of removal is a critical protection that ensures an individual is not deported while their legal claims are still being adjudicated. When a department is accused of bypassing these stays, it is effectively accused of stripping away the final layer of protection afforded by the law. This operational defiance suggests a prioritization of removal statistics over the integrity of the legal process itself. Such a culture of expediency over legality is often difficult to root out once it takes hold within a massive federal bureaucracy. The hearing illuminated how these technical violations, when aggregated, constitute a significant departure from the constitutional requirement of due process. The rhetoric used by Secretary Noem regarding activist judges is part of a broader trend in American political life that seeks to categorize legal rulings based on their political palatability. This strategy is effective in mobilizing a political base, but it is corrosive to the stability of a legal system that relies on the perception of impartiality. When a federal judge issues an injunction, it is based on an interpretation of statutes and constitutional principles, not on a desire to participate in political activism. By framing these rulings as politically motivated, the Secretary provides herself with a justification for ignoring them, at least in the court of public opinion. This tactic creates a dangerous precedent where any government official could potentially disregard any court order by simply labeling the judge as biased or ideologically driven. Furthermore, the issue of detaining American citizens unlawfully highlights the catastrophic risks associated with a lack of rigorous oversight and transparency. The American citizenship status should be an absolute shield against the summary enforcement powers of the Department of Homeland Security. When this shield is pierced due to administrative error or systemic negligence, It signals a failure of the most basic function of the department, to protect the rights of those it serves. The testimony during the hearing suggested that these errors might not be mere accidents but the result of a system that emphasizes aggressive enforcement over precision. Without a clear and honest accounting of these failures, the public is left to wonder if the department has the capacity or the will to protect the civil liberties of the population. The response of the Secretary to the calls for her resignation also reflects a significant shift in the nature of political scandal in the United States. In previous eras, the mere credible accusation of perjury or constitutional violation would be enough to trigger a formal investigation and perhaps a voluntary departure from office. Today, however, the political environment is so polarized that any criticism is interpreted through a partisan lens, allowing officials to survive controversies that would have once been career-ending. This resilience in the face of scandal is not necessarily a sign of innocence, but rather a sign of a political system that has lost its ability to enforce ethical norms. The hearing demonstrated that when accountability is viewed as an optional political cost, the incentives for truthful testimony and legal compliance are dangerously weakened. The legal and ethical implications of the Secretary's testimony also intersect with the concept of sovereign immunity and the limitations of holding federal officials personally accountable. Under American law, it is notoriously difficult to hold a cabinet-level official legally responsible for the actions of their department unless a direct and willful violation of a clearly established law can be proven. This legal high bar provides a degree of protection that can sometimes be misused to shield officials from the consequences of their policy decisions. The hearing served as a reminder that while legal accountability might be difficult to achieve in a courtroom, political accountability is the primary responsibility of Congress. When the latter fails due to a lack of cooperation or transparency, the entire system of checks and balances is brought into question. The impact of this testimony on the relationship between the federal government and state-level authorities is another critical layer of this unfolding drama. As the Department of Homeland Security navigates its enforcement mission, it often relies on the cooperation of state and local law enforcement agencies. When the department is perceived as acting in defiance of federal courts or ignoring the rights of citizens, that cooperation can begin to fray. State officials may become more hesitant to partner with a federal agency that they view as operating outside the bounds of the law. This tension adds another level of complexity to an already strained immigration enforcement system, potentially leading to a patchwork of compliance and resistance across the various states of the Union. The analysis of the Secretary's performance also reveals a calculated attempt to use the hearing as a platform for a broader political message. By focusing on her successes at the Supreme Court and framing her opponents as being out of touch with the needs of national security, she sought to control the narrative. This approach turns a solemn oversight hearing into a campaign-style event, where the audience is not the committee members but the public watching at home. This shift toward performative politics undermines the deliberative nature of the legislative process and makes it harder for members of Congress to engage in a meaningful fact-finding mission. The drama of the hearing, while compelling for viewers, often comes at the expense of a clear and detailed understanding of the issues at hand. As we move toward the final stages of this analysis, it is important to consider the long-term consequences of a department that refuses to acknowledge its documented errors. A government agency that cannot admit to its mistakes is an agency that cannot learn or improve. The cycle of litigation, defiance, and further litigation only serves to waste taxpayer resources and further erode public confidence in the federal government. The Secretary's refusal to provide direct answers regarding enforcement failures suggests a lack of commitment to the kind of administrative reform that is necessary to prevent future violations of the law. This resistance to change is perhaps the most significant hurdle to restoring the integrity of the Department of Homeland Security. The hearing ultimately served as a mirror reflecting the current state of American governance, where the pursuit of power often eclipses the pursuit of the truth. The conflict between Representative Thanadar and Secretary Noem is a microcosm of the larger battle for the future of the American Republic. It is a battle over whether the law is a set of universal rules that apply to everyone, including the most powerful officials, or whether it is merely a tool to be used or discarded based on political necessity. The answer to this question will determine the health and longevity of the democratic institutions that have sustained the nation for over 2 centuries. The pursuit of accountability remains a difficult and often thankless task, but it is one that is essential for the preservation of liberty and the rule of law. The culmination of the congressional hearing featuring Secretary Noem and Representative Thanadar leaves the American public at a crossroads regarding the future of administrative accountability. This final phase of the inquiry has laid bare a profound disconnect between the executive's operational ambitions and the legislative branch's mandate for oversight. When a government official views an investigation into potential perjury not as a legal crisis but as a political theater, the very fabric of democratic governance begins to unravel. The persistent refusal to acknowledge documented violations of federal law suggests that the Department of Homeland Security may be operating under a doctrine of exceptionalism. This doctrine posits that the urgency of the mission, in this case, border security and immigration enforcement, somehow exempts its leaders from the standard requirements of transparency and truthfulness. The long-term health of the American Republic depends on the principle that no individual, regardless of their title or the perceived importance of their role, is above the law. Throughout this discourse, we have seen how the strategic use of language, such as the dismissal of judicial rulings as activism, serves to erode this fundamental principle. By repositioning the department as a victim of a biased judiciary, the Secretary effectively attempts to shift the burden of proof from the government back onto the courts. However, the evidence presented by the committee regarding illegal detentions and ignored court orders remains a stubborn reality that cannot be erased by rhetorical flourishes. These are not merely administrative hiccups. They are significant breaches of the constitutional contract that must be addressed with more than just political defiance. The crisis of accountability is further exacerbated by the way in which modern digital media consumes and redistributes these moments of institutional conflict. In an era of viral clips and soundbite-driven news, the nuanced legal arguments often get lost, leaving behind only the imagery of confrontation and partisan posturing. This environment rewards those who remain steadfast in their defiance, rather than those who seek to find common ground or admit to operational failures. Consequently, the incentive structure for cabinet officials has shifted toward maintaining a flawless political image at all costs, even if it means providing testimony that appears to contradict the facts on the ground. This trend poses a direct threat to the ability of Congress to function as a fact-finding body, as the truth is increasingly treated as a negotiable commodity. To restore faith in federal institutions, there must be a renewed commitment to the ethical standards that once governed public service. This includes a return to the understanding that providing testimony to Congress is a sacred duty that requires absolute honesty, even when that honesty reveals uncomfortable truths about one's own department. The pursuit of national security and the protection of civil liberties are not mutually exclusive goals. Rather, they are the twin pillars upon which the legitimacy of the government rests. When one is sacrificed for the other, as the allegations in this hearing suggest, the resulting imbalance creates a vacuum that is quickly filled by public distrust and institutional decay. The path forward requires a rigorous re-examination of the protocols that allowed these enforcement errors to occur and a genuine effort to provide the public with the answers they deserve. The role of the American citizen in this process is to remain vigilant and to demand a higher standard of conduct from their representatives and appointed officials. Democracy is not a spectator sport, and the events described in this analysis serve as a stark reminder of the consequences of political apathy. When the mechanisms of check and balances are tested, It is the public's engagement that provides the ultimate safeguard against the abuse of power. The hearing between Thanadar and Noem should not be seen as just another partisan squabble, but as a call to action for a deeper national conversation about the limits of executive authority. It is a moment to reaffirm that the Constitution is not a flexible document to be interpreted for political convenience, but a rigid set of rules that must be followed. Furthermore, the legal community and constitutional scholars have a vital role to play in defending the independence of the judiciary from political attacks. When high-ranking officials use their platform to delegitimize federal judges, it is incumbent upon those who understand the law to speak out in defense of the system. The integrity of the court system relies on a collective agreement to respect its decisions, even when they are unpopular or politically inconvenient. If the executive branch is allowed to pick and choose which orders to follow, the entire concept of the rule of law becomes an empty promise. The allegations of ignoring deportation stay orders are particularly egregious because they strike at the heart of the court's power to provide emergency relief to those who may be facing irreparable harm. Looking toward the future, the fallout from this hearing will likely influence the legislative agenda for years to come. There is a clear need for stronger statutory protections to prevent the detention of American citizens and to ensure that deportation processes are transparent and subject to immediate judicial review. Congress may need to consider new mechanisms for enforcing its oversight power, ensuring that witnesses who provide evasive or misleading testimony face meaningful consequences. The current stalemate suggests that the existing tools of subpoena and public shaming may no longer be sufficient in a political landscape where officials are insulated by partisan loyalty. Strengthening these mechanisms is essential for maintaining the balance of power that has sustained the American experiment for over 2 centuries. Ultimately, the story of this hearing is the story of a nation struggling to hold on to its core values in a time of intense polarization and rapid change. The accusations of perjury and constitutional violations against Secretary Noem represent a challenge that goes to the very core of how the United States is governed. Whether the system will prove resilient enough to overcome this crisis of accountability remains to be seen. However, the persistent efforts of those like Representative Thanadar to demand the truth provide a glimmer of hope that the principles of transparency and the rule of law still have their defenders. The pursuit of an honest government is a never-ending task, and this hearing is but one chapter in a much larger and ongoing struggle. As the record of these proceedings is archived, it will serve as a testament to the importance of institutional integrity and the dangers of unchecked executive power. The lessons learned from this confrontation must be applied to the way future leaders are vetted, trained, and held accountable. It is not enough to have good laws. We must also have individuals of character who are willing to execute those laws with a sense of moral obligation to the public. The refusal to admit error, the dismissal of judicial authority, and the obfuscation of the truth are all symptoms of a deeper malaise that must be cured if the American system is to remain a model of democratic governance. The resolution of this crisis will depend on whether the nation chooses the path of accountability or the path of continued institutional erosion. In conclusion, the discourse surrounding Secretary Noem's testimony highlights a critical inflection point for the American administrative state. The tension between enforcement efficiency and legal adherence has reached a level that requires a definitive national response. By centering the conversation on the facts, the law, and the ethical responsibilities of those in power, we can begin to rebuild the trust that has been so severely damaged. The pursuit of the truth, however difficult or politically costly, remains the only viable way to ensure that the government remains a servant of the people rather than its master. The hearing may have ended, but the questions it raised will continue to echo through the halls of power, demanding a resolution that honors the best traditions of the American Republic.